those prophecies of previous prophets is in and of itself a miracle. If you take a miracle to make a supernatural event, then to foretell something is also a supernatural event. The habit of the ulama of seerah, the ulama of who study the life of the Prophet ﷺ, their habit is to normally mention the prophecies of our Prophet ﷺ in the previous scriptures, in the Bible, in the Torah. They mention it when they begin to talk about the actual prophethood, and not when they talk about the actual birth. So inshallah, when we get to the actual prophethood, the beginning of prophethood at the age of 40, when the first revelation comes down, maybe then we can visit this topic of the prophecies in the previous scriptures. Another topic which some scholars would discuss at this stage, and some would do at the end, and maybe we'll delay this as well, is the physical appearance of the Prophet ﷺ, known as the shama'il. But that's something, again, I think we can delay for now till later. So now we'll begin with the early life of the Prophet ﷺ. So as we know, he had his mother, and he didn't have a father. His father, Abdullah, had passed away about 18 years old when he died, after having left his wife Amina pregnant with the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ's household is now his mother, and of course they had slaves. And one of the slaves of the Prophet ﷺ's mother was called Ayman, or of his father was called Ayman. Ayman becomes a very important part of the household of the Prophet ﷺ. She was of African origin, and she was a member of the household. Slaves in Arabia at the time would normally come through war, through being prisoners of war. And once somebody sold into slavery, they would now they would be a slave of the family that they now served, and they had complex norms and customs surrounding slavery. One of the main ones was that once a person is a slave of a household, he is also a member of the household. So it's not that they sleep in the shed outside, they're almost a member of the household. And it was quite common to sometimes adopt, if a person likes a particular male slave or a female, they'll adopt them. That was also quite normal. So Ayman was from the house of the Prophet ﷺ, and she was very close to the Prophet ﷺ. Amina and Ayman were the two people who nurtured the Prophet ﷺ in his early years. So we can imagine how close he was. And then she lived a very long life, and as we know, she passed away after the Prophet ﷺ passed away. In fact, a number of years after the Prophet ﷺ passed away, when she was in old age, and she was one of the greatest of the earliest Muslims, if not one of the earliest Muslims, maybe amongst the first 5 to 10 people to accept Islam. So her name was Ayman radiyallahu anha. She was also one of the foster mothers of the Prophet ﷺ who fostered her. I think I mentioned last month about the third foster, or the third lady who would breastfeed the Prophet ﷺ, and that was Thuwayba. Thuwayba was again a former slave of Abu Lahab, the Prophet ﷺ's uncle, his father's brother, who Abu Lahab freed out of happiness when she gave him the glad tidings of his nephew being born. But Thuwayba was also a part of the family now. She wasn't just going to live on the street, so she was a part of it. So she also fostered the Prophet ﷺ. It was a habit of the Arabs at the time that they considered the purest expression of Arabness, or the purest Arabic, or the place in which the purest Arab culture was preserved was in the desert. And they would use the term Ma'adiyya. Ma'ad is the ancestor. One of the ancestors of probably half of all Arabs is a man called Ma'ad, the son of Adnan, who is a descendant of Ismail alayhi salam. So many of the tribes of Arabia, especially Makkah, especially people from around Makkah, they considered the purest form of life to be the life of the desert, where people were bound by codes of honor, where people had to survive in the wild, where people learn all the skills of living that also apply in the city. You learn them, they are highlighted in the desert, right? How to defend yourself, leadership skills, how to ride a horse, how to use weapons, and most importantly to Arabs almost, or as important as fighting was language. The purest expression of Arabic language was also in the desert. All of this was because the purest form of Arab life, the original Arab life was the desert life. In fact, there's some theories that the word Arab originally meant desert. That's why even in Arabic, the word for Bedouins is A'rab, which literally means those of the Arabs. So that's why it was very common for people in towns like Mecca to want their children to spend the first 2 years of their life, the first few years of their life in the desert, where they believe they get the purest air, the purest Arabic, the purest language. So the years in which they're going to learn the language, the age of 1, the age of 2, the age of 3, they're in the desert, so they learn the purest form of language. And they also believe that they are more protected from illness and from diseases. There's more likelihood of having disease in the cities, in the towns where people live together naturally. So they also thought there's a better chance of my baby surviving if the baby is in the desert. So all of these reasons, it was basically their education. Instead of education being from 4 till 16, it was from 0 till 2. So this education would happen in the deserts amongst the Arabs, amongst the Bedouin Arabs. So every now and then, some Bedouins would come, some couples, Bedouin couples who'd recently had a child. So the mother, so the wife is able to provide milk. And then they would come to Mecca, towns like Mecca, and ask around if there's any newborn. And if they want, they would offer to look after their child for them. And the Meccans were glad to give their children this way. So the tribe that lived near Mecca was the tribe of Banu Sa'ad bin Bakr. So Banu Sa'ad, their tribe were Bedouins effectively. So some people from Banu Sa'ad had come to Mecca looking for newborns. Eventually, one particular woman called Halima, she ended up with the Prophet ﷺ. Initially, she decided not to, because she thought that there's no father. If there's no father, I won't get a good wage or a good gift, because that's what they hoped for. In the end, because she didn't find anybody else, she decided to just suffice with the Prophet ﷺ. Now, I've mentioned before, I think I mentioned last month, that in the culture of the Arabs at the time, just because a person was powerful, it didn't mean they were rich. Right? It was to be powerful and influential in society. Money definitely helped, because then you can show off your generosity, and when you show off your generosity, people are attracted to you, and that way you build influence. But it doesn't mean that every chief was rich. So for someone like the Prophet ﷺ was from Banu Hashim, a great family. His grandfather was Abdul Muttalib, who was the undisputed chief of Mecca. That didn't mean that they were millionaires, right? It didn't mean that they were drowning in money. You have to understand that Arab life at the time was just poverty. To be rich at that time wasn't necessarily rich compared to the other societies, the other cultures. And if a person was rich, he wouldn't then invest and have big businesses and companies. There's only so much you can do with them. You can buy camels, you can buy horses, and then not much else. You can buy land, maybe in a different town. Makkah didn't have land that was worth buying, in that sense, fertile. But then what do you do with the money? So you spend it on the poor to then gain a reputation of being generous. So what I'm trying to explain is that some people misunderstand this, that how was the Prophet ﷺ from a poor family, but yet we say that he's from a powerful family. So he was from a powerful family, but that didn't necessarily equate to riches. Another thing to remember is that Mecca's economy had absolutely no agriculture, no crops, nothing grew in Mecca. Allah describes Mecca in the Quran. Ibrahim alayhi salam is quoted as describing Mecca in the Quran as Wadin Ghayri Dhi Zar', a valley that has absolutely no crops, nothing can grow there. So the people of Mecca, their entire livelihoods depended on trade. And Allah also mentions this in the Quran, the Ilafi Quraysh, the tribe of Quraysh who inhabited Mecca. Allah mentions the Ilafi Quraysh, Ilafihim Rihlat al-Shita'i wal-Sayf. Allah mentions that He had made easy for them, Allah had made easy for the Quraysh the trade that they used to do. So the Quraysh had carved for themselves a trade route to the north and to the south, to Syria and to Yemen. So from Mecca in the center, in summer they would have a massive, every single household of Mecca would partake or would have some investment into a large caravan that would then go to Syria every summer, and you'd spend a few months there and come back, and all of the profits they would then be given back, and this would be a huge deal. And every winter they'd have another trade journey that would go to the south to Yemen. They had this because of their unique position in Arabia, because they were seen as the protectors of Allah's house, they were seen as the protectors of Mecca, of the Kaaba, the organizers of Hajj. So due to all of these extra the advantages or priorities that the Quraysh had responsibilities that the Quraysh had. The rest of Arabia respected them. So a few generations before the Prophet ﷺ was born, Hashim, the great grandfather of the Prophet ﷺ, and other people like him, they forged alliances with all of the tribes of Arabia, all of the Bedouins of Arabia, that you don't attack us when we go on our trade routes. So they carved these trade routes. And they've also made deals with the Roman or the Roman governors of Syria and the Yemeni kings that you allow us to come for trade. So trade was how they survived. But if 1 year you had a bad trade, then you've got to suffer for that entire year till the following year. That's also another thing to understand. This is also referenced in the Quran that at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, Quraysh, they were not flowing, money wasn't flowing very well. Business wasn't good at the time. That was just some background. It also provides some context in the way the Prophet ﷺ poor. Allah mentions in one book that the Prophet ﷺ was poor. So all of this, inshallah, is context for this. He was poor growing up or early on in his life. Now that he's with Banu Sa'id, the tribe of the Bedouin tribe, and Halima specifically is looking after him, he spends 2 years there. He spends 2 years with Halima, and that was the agreement with Amina, that he'll spend 2 years. But within those 2 years, the amount of blessings and barakah and miracles that Halima witnessed with this blessed child, she realized that this child is something special. This began on the journey back from Mecca to their homes, to their camps. She said that their camels or their horses or their conveyance that they were travelling on, it was the weakest and the slowest. But now that she had the Prophet ﷺ with her, her animal was the fastest. So immediately they thought something is strange here, something is special. Then when they went to their home, they had sheep. So again, just a bit on the society and how society worked. I mentioned that the Quraysh, they survived off trade. All the townspeople, the townsfolk, people who lived in the towns and the cities of Arabia, I guess throughout history this has been the case. If you're not a trader, you are a farmer. You're a farmer or you're a trader, especially in tribes. But the Bedouins, they don't necessarily, they survive off looking after goats and sheep, and then raiding caravans, raiding travelers, banditry. So the Banu Sa'id, the tribe of Banu Sa'id, they depended on sheep and goats. They used to find pastures. There wasn't much in Arabia, but they would try and find some pastures, and then they would settle there for a while, for a year, their sheep and their goat, and then they would move on. So the Prophet ﷺ, when he arrived in Banu Sa'id,